So when we came in last year at MIX, and when we started trying to explain and articulate some of the challenges that we have as designers, and when I go back and think about this, I always refer to a lot of work that John did. And one of the things we talked about is we talked about design as a metaphor, right? Has anybody ever, designers love metaphors, right? So we think of design as this wonderful vision that we have, and we sell customers that vision, right? And this might be our vision of design, right? We typically do specs, right? If you're a designer, has anybody ever gotten a set of wireframes, right? Or mood boards? Anybody? Raise your hand if you've ever seen a wireframe. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. And then sometimes we use comps. How many people use Photoshop in the room to start design, right? How many people have gotten Photoshop files that they have to figure out how to use? Right, okay. And, we'll often take those Photoshop files, and it's this great palette for us to experiment and build our design. But the challenge is we eventually have to get it into something that we're going to build software with, right? So in this example, it might be HTML and CSS, right? Some of us actually start designing in HTML and CSS, right? Because it's easier. How many people don't touch Photoshop at all and just go right into the tool and the technology they're using? Can you raise your hands? Okay. But eventually, though, there's that wall, right, between how a designer designs something and how something gets built. And that wall typically occurs from the design phase to the production phase. We've all been there, right, at some point, right? And what happens when we're done with this is our final result. So when we look back at the goals of Microsoft, and when we look back at Expression Studio and Visual Studio, we have some goals. And one of the goals is to make sure that if you're a developer, that you can actually work effectively with the designs that are given to you, right? Because we sell visions to customers all the time, whether it's software, whether it's a product or a service, and this is increasingly important in software. But the challenge we've always had is our tools and our processes and workflow have been a really difficult thing for us to accomplish to do that job well. And it's important now, right? Because right now we just can't write one piece of software. We just can't build one website, right? We've got to optimize and look at all the devices and everything that somebody's going to use in the future to interact with our company or our brand. So one of the things that we try to do is make design a first-class citizen in this process. And to make design a first-class citizen in the process of designing software, we really had to stop and fundamentally think about how did we get to the place where this is the result that we give people. And fundamentally, the reason that we're there is because we're taking an old set of processes that was really designed out of the print world and for print production, and we've tried to adapt it to the web and software design. And in some cases, some of the good tenets and foundations of software design and how we design, we just don't work very good as designers and developers all the time together. So what this session is about is we'll go very technical and we'll go very deep today, but it's about practically, if we look at Silverlight and WPF and we look at things like XAML, how well are they working in the design studio right now and with developers? So what I'd like to do is introduce our panel, and I'm going to have each of them briefly talk a little bit about themselves. And we're going to do a little bit of roundtable conversation for a while, and then we're going to open it up to have questions. Do people have questions? I mean, are you curious when you see some of this stuff and you're like, okay, I understand Microsoft, how that works, but tell me how it really works, right? Show me someone that's built something with this, and I want to hear what they love about it. I want to hear what they're challenged about it. That's our goal today. Is that kind of what everybody thought they were going to get in this session today? Okay, that's good. All right, so let's move ahead. Oh, I should probably go full screen, huh? So Chip, I'd like to start with you. Chip is from Tribal. Has anybody heard of Tribal, or you know what it is? Tribal's an advertising agency. I won't say a digital advertising agency because that would be wrong, right?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, but it's also was recently named, was it Ad Age's Agency of the Year?
Yeah, Network of the Year.
And talk a little bit about your background.
Okay, so I'm the lead technical architect for Tribal DDB in Chicago, and one of my responsibilities is really to make sure that our solutions that we build for our clients work smoothly, so that the translation from the designers, their intent that they've provided, we can actually get that out the door and get that solution up and live for our clients.
Okay. So, Rich.
Hi, I'm Rich Weston. I'm the Principal Design Technologist with Udesic. My principal role is taking the designer's vision and executing it on a variety of technologies, primarily ASP.NET, Silverlight, and WPF. And just making sure, like Chip said, that the whole experience goes smoothly and we get as high a fidelity end result as we had in the initial vision.
And Nathan.
I'm an interactive designer. I came out of the WPF product, so I've had a lot of experience with WPF, and in doing so, I'm kind of set up well for Silverlight. But yeah, we at Identity Mind, we do a lot of using a middle role of interaction or integrator role.
Okay. So. Jeff.
I work for Project 202 in Austin, Texas, and we typically do not develop anything in-house. So what we do is we design a blueprint of an application and give that to the developers. And since we've been using WPF, we've been able to, instead of giving them a set of very detailed specifications, actually deliver an interface to them that's working. So my role is both visual designer in creating the look and feel of the application, but also the integrator. So I work fairly closely with the developers for our clients and make sure that, just like these guys said, the design goes from what the design is supposed to look like into the final results.
And then Bo.
Hi, I'm Bo Amber. I run Metallic in San Francisco. We were out here last year and demoed Top Banana with Silverlight 2.0. We work with a number of different applications, Silverlight, WPF, .NET, also Flash, and other related technologies. Been doing interactive for about 10 years and work with a team of designers and developers. And we really focus on the technology and just have a really high respect for the design, because that's what the users see first and interact with. And if they're not attracted to it, if they don't appreciate what it has to offer visually, they usually don't give it the time to discover the depth of it, where the real meat of the application usually is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So I want to start our question here. The reason we're all here is because you have experience with a lot of different technologies, right? Both Silverlight and WPF. A lot of us have worked with Flash and other rich media technologies in the past. And I kind of want to start the question right now. I think fundamentally that it almost feels like we're on the verge of a big shift in how we design software right now. And I'm curious, from both a business perspective and a design and development perspective, if it feels that way to you. Does it feel like some of the challenges and some of the ways that we work right now are being fundamentally challenged? And talk a little bit about how WPF and Silverlight might have impacted that. And Bo, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a much higher demand for the visual quality of the applications and also the expectation of the client and the users. And, a lot of things that we work on are still ad and brand driven. And I think the nice thing that you can do now with the range of flexibility that you have in design is you can really find the key identity aspects of the client or the project or the brand and much more subtly integrate in the secondary or the primary themes, whether it's just the corporate brand or the objective of the project or the application, and how you skin it, how you style it. It's a lot more interesting than building a website and slapping a banner ad on top of it to do some sort of corporate messaging. We've dealt with that a lot in doing portal or cross-department applications for large corporations. Everybody has a stake and a say at the table. So you literally divide up an application or a page, and everybody has to have their element here and a link here and a promo for this here, and it just becomes this big yard sale mess. And I think with interactive applications, you can do things much more in a time and add a real depth to the content and the design. And I think that makes the pages much more useful. They can be purpose designed for what the current task or challenge is, whether it's capturing information through forms or just spreading news or creating some sort of search visualization applications. Really being able to redesign the screen and the layout and the flow as the user goes through an experience, I think makes an application much more appealing, makes it much more useful, but it also makes a much wider range of things available to the user, because usually it's just a single click away, or things will cycle through and present to the user. So I think a lot of those things are represented in design. Technologically speaking, it's the same challenges. It's connecting to data. It's providing things to the user. It's providing a stable experience. I think there's a foundation there for all of those things that we can now build on top of. And something like Blend on top of the Visual Studio process allows the designer to really get in there and be very particular visually. And I think it just makes the apps much more interesting. But in the end, it provides much more for the user to experience, which I think is
So Bo, can I add a follow-on question?
Yeah.
In your company, you have what's your split of like designers and developers? Or
Yeah, it's roughly half and half. Depends
Yeah.
on the projects.
So when you actually work on a project right now, do you start with tools like Blend, or do you start with other tools?
We find more and more that we start in the end product.
Okay.
If we're doing a website or Flash or something like that, a lot of times we'd start in Photoshop or Illustrator and do a mock-up and then do a prototype and then do a beta, and then somewhere in that process we'd go into production code. With Silverlight and WPF, we start typically in Blend from a designer and doing prototyping and kind of walkthroughs. A lot of times with larger projects, we'll still need to do a wireframe or a brand comp or something like that. But very early on, the designer who's leading a project will usually start a project in Blend and actually start making some interactivity to it. And then a developer will get involved once it's kind of been flowed out and we've gone through some workflow iterations. And typically we'll add Visual Studio into it and start cleaning things up and moving them around. But now we're finding that we can take what used to be throwaway prototype concepts and very directly roll them into production code. And it's much easier to toss between designer and developer, but also to have both work simultaneously.
Okay. So Jeff, you have kind of a unique background before you started working in design and software development, in that you worked in motion graphics and special effects for a while. Does any of that impact some of the work that you're asked to do today? And are those skills valuable today in terms of how you design applications?
I definitely think they are. A lot of interfaces that not only can be positioned on the screen in XY coordinates, but you have time also. So it's being able to draw upon any animation experience or broadcast design like that really allows you to think about the process a little differently, about thinking how transitions should happen from one thing to another, and really thinking about how do you present the information over time to people. Do they need to see everything at once, or can you build it on at certain points?
So Rich, you've worked on some rather large sites in the past.
Yes, a few.
And when you think about some of your experiences in working in large sites and some of the demands and challenges about that, and you look at RIA technology, can you elaborate a little bit on what some of the challenges are you see from a workflow perspective? I mean, if you're coming from the background of traditional web development or even traditional application development, where applications get served on the web, what are some of the challenges that you've experienced in the past with doing that?
The big one that I ran into particularly was localization issues. And building things so that you can factor it out and make it easy to deploy various sections of an application, make it easy to manage the content and update that stuff. In terms of developer workflow, you have to build a lot of your core functionality to be aware of that stuff up front. You can't really add localization later. So really you spend a lot of time looking at the end goals and whether you need to support things like bidirectional flows. If you're building a website, that's particularly complicated. And generally, you have to map those things out and just make sure that you build a core foundation that you can build on top of very, very quickly, and make sure that you think that things stay well factored as you move forward, especially with huge websites. It's very easy to throw more and more functionality into it, and eventually you muddy the water. So making sure you have a clean core is definitely very important.
So, Chip, you work in what I would characterize as a heterogeneous environment. There's lots of different operating systems. I would imagine that a lot of your designers probably work on Macintosh computers.
That would be correct.
Elaborate a little bit on your workflow and how you build applications right now, and some of the ways that designers have touched the workflow, like with Silverlight and WPF.
Well,
Both good and bad.
Okay, so like traditionally it ends up being sort of a dead-end process. You get your comps, the PSDs, and we cut up the graphics. We try to translate what their intent was with that comp and build out the page. And with Silverlight, with WPF, there's this whole new layer there that's not really, it's not there. The intent's hard to to divine out of a static comp. So there's transitions. There's there's all sorts of building emotive brand-oriented experiences with these tools. It's really hard to use that traditional print type workflow. And so, you know, when we've worked in these technologies, we've done things more in almost a paired programming sort of a mode where the designer, him and I, are working back and forth, sharing ideas, throwing the ball back and forth, trying to do it more in a ping-pong manner. May not be as efficient of a process, but I think as you're learning these technologies, I think sharing your ideas and having that back and forth is very important. I don't think the companies, if you're trying to adopt these, that you're going to be successful if you still do the siloed approach and you still work it with just hand off and here you go.
Okay. So Nathan, I'd like to ask you a little bit about workflow. In conversations that you and I have had in the past, I always say the most important thing for someone to figure out is who owns the XAML and when do you go to XAML. And one of the things that you've always said is, well, maybe nobody owns it, right? Or that we all need to own it. Can you talk a little bit about some of the processes and experience that IdentityMine has used when they work with WPF, and talk a little bit about some of the roles and how you define them, and what are the steps in the process you go through when you've worked on projects?
So to clarify what I mean by nobody owns the XAML, I think there's.
And actually, you know what? Let me stop. Does everybody in the room know what XAML is? Okay, so we're comfortable with that. Okay, good. I just want to check. Thank you.
Just there's kind of an attitude of, well, the design tools primarily are affecting XAML, and it's kind of the easy area. It's like it's the language that designers can more easily broach and get into. And I kind of feel like it's an easy assumption to draw, but it's kind of a limiting assumption, because if you make that assumption, you're going to be disturbed later on when you find that your devs spend a lot of time in your XAML, changing your XAML. And we've seen yesterday where the dev was kind of like the initiator of the XAML. But I like to think of XAML as the thing that you use to maintain designability. It's that tool in between people that allows people to continue to talk. So as long as you treat it that way, it actually allows people, like designers who actually start to lean more towards the technical side, can start to experiment and break out of the box and do things that they couldn't do.
Does it give you a chance, as a designer? I always like to spit and polish things, as long as someone will let me, and it gives you a bit more of an ability to do that than maybe traditional workflows.
Yeah, I think like going back to what you said about what our roles are, we typically kind of take we've got three major roles, which is we've got our real creative, we've got our integrator role, and then we've got our dev. And
so I have a question then.
Yeah.
Did the integrator go to design school, or did he?
Actually, in our case, we have dev-leaning integrators and design-leaning integrators. It's been a pretty hot topic internally. Like, what do we call ourselves, and how do you let the integrator not be typecast into something? Because people just make assumptions what the integrator is, and a lot of times those are wrong. So we have people who are more towards the dev side, but they have design sensibilities. And I think that's what the key to being an integrator is, being able to broach both sides, being able to be kind of an acid test to make sure that the design is up to par, and an acid test to make sure that the dev is, or at least knowing how to handshake with the devs.
Sure.
Do
you think
the process.
When we talk about the integrator role, is there an archetype for this role? Because part of what it reminds me of, almost, but I think it's more, is a role that, did anybody ever have continuity directors back in the day? Ever heard of that term? It's a movie term from Hollywood. And it was the people that their job was to make sure that, if you were holding a cup of coffee when we did the shot, that when we redid the shot, you'd still be holding a cup of coffee. And in the early days of the web, some companies would have these people that would just make sure that design would get preserved through implementation. And it sounds a bit like that to me, but it sounds also, I think of the Matrix, where everybody's just looking at the numbers running down the screen, and they said, I don't even see numbers anymore, I just see the world. How would you define the role? I mean, when you talk about integrator, what are the skill sets that you try to develop, whether someone comes from the developer side or the designer side?
I think the key thing that distinguishes an integrator from, I call them production artists. These are the guys that you rely on to do a lot of the grunt work. They know how to use the tools. They understand. They can actually see the design, the fidelity of the design, and actually apply it and not lose track on the process. I think really one of the key things that really differentiates an integrator from a production artist is that typically production artists are doing a known product. They're doing something that has been done before over and over and over again. So there's actually, solid understanding of what needs to be done. You can actually measure it. A lot of times the integrator is kind of, more of we're solving puzzles that haven't been solved before, doing interactions that haven't been done before,
Okay.
things like that.
Okay. So I'd like to poll my panelists. How many folks use the integrator role in how you work with Silverlight and WPF? Does anybody else do it? Okay. Bo, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you work. And I'd like to expand on something that Jeff offered up earlier, where there's a whole lot of stuff that we do in software that we have to show, right? Because it's really, can you imagine showing a picture of the iPhone to say, and here's how it works, right? How do you handle some of that in the design process? Just the nuance and the motion and the design and all the things that you just can't represent with the static image. And talk to me a little bit about your design process and how it maybe differs from the integrator role.
Sure. Yeah, and I think just to talk about the integrators, I think we rely more on project managers and producer type role, really interfacing with the client, and it's less about impacting the work and the design directly as managing what the requirements are, what the needs are, what the changes are, and feeding that information back to the design and the developer. One of the things I found working in print was about the worst thing you can do is have the client talking directly to the designer, and that was actually me then. And you get the phone ringing every 5 minutes of, oh, can I move this over here? Can I move that over there? As soon as the line gets blurred and they realize that phone is connected to your hand, is connected to their design, it never stops moving. And I think the integrator role is very important, and you need something to bridge that designer developer. But I think keeping an eye on the workflow from the client perspective is very important from just a business management, a time management perspective, and also just preserving the overall intent and quality of the project. Otherwise, it just kind of goes in these giant circles. And I think in terms of what you're talking about from the design process, the static page is very difficult to work with. Again, coming back to print, there's a lot of great established workflows and process from wireframe, blocking the information, doing design comps. You've got your page, you've got your bleeds, you've got your margins. It's a very refined process where you can detail and interact with it and get a very good idea of what's going to come out in print. Working with interactive technology, you have this other dimension, which is time that we were talking about before, and it's nearly impossible to put on the page. Our designers have worked up a few different methodologies for working with that and really kind of trying to describe a meta visual language where it's kind of a hybrid between a wire flow and a flow chart. And we can, kind of create these metaphors or abstractions of...
Can I ask a question, Bo?
Yeah.
When you start that process, do you take a Sharpie? Or are you using a tool to help you do that?
I like to use marble, stones, and chisels.
Okay,
No.
okay.
Whiteboards are still, I think, the best design tool and brainstorming tool. I think I love to do everything digitally, but it's still... I also believe very firmly that if you can't design it or make it work in a paper process, you just don't understand all of the logistics, and you're working with too many pieces of information. I mean, I really believe you can pull out a piece of paper and sketch out a full architecture, a full wireframe, a full design, pass it around, review it, change it, and use that as your manual all the way through. It's much more effective to do that digitally using wireframes, using flowcharts, using interactive programs. But I actually really like to go back to a little more hands-on methodology. Just to make sure that you're not, we find that there's all these little details that we want to work in, that we want to carry forward. We want to remember all these rules, all these pieces of logic, plan for all of these version 3, 4, 5, 6 things that are 5 years down the road. And you just start working with this mass of information, and you lose sight of what you're building now, what you're building later. And so really designing the right amount of information and interacting with that's very important. And I find going back to a paper or a more condensed process helps you flush out what's really important and what's just extra. But again, with Blend, going in and starting with an interactive prototype more and more becomes our wireframe, our manual, our project guide, because you can click on things, you can interact with it, you can see how it's going to animate. And I'm really big on kind of creating a logic and a flow tree that at least has a placeholder for every page. It can just be blank with the title and say, this is the login screen. But having all of your timelines and kind of your roadmap so you can see the depth, how many levels deep you need to go down, where things are going to be linear that you can navigate page 1 to page 2 to page 3 versus things that are going to jump into one section of an application or experience to another. Again, you can do these things on paper, but working with the XAML, working with Blend, working with the other tools, you can develop kind of a working model that you just build out as you go.
So this is interesting, and it brings me back. I have a confession to make, too, that I worked in film and video for a long time before I started working in technology. And Jeff, I'm curious. To me, this almost sounds like a typical production process that you'd use when you're making a movie, right? Where everybody argues about the script first, right? And it's a very low-fidelity way that they start working. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about some of the projects that you've worked on at Project 202 and what your workflow has been when you started and how you went to XAML?
Yeah, we do very similar things. However, we leave XAML to the very end. We start with user research, and we build the needs and the requirements up front, and then we begin doing ideation and going through and brainstorming and coming up with some neat ideas. And then we move to detailed design, where we build out wireframes, just starting on a whiteboard or on paper, and then eventually moving to Illustrator and getting all the minute details in there. During that process, we go to start doing visual design, where the designers are working, typically in Photoshop. Some things are still done in Illustrator. But this allows them to really nail the design and not think about much about what is the control that this thing is going to use in order to make this thing. So they can really concentrate on the look and feel and not be worried about implementation details. So then for a WPF project, what we do is we take those visual designs, and because they're mostly bitmap Photoshop images, we have to rebuild them in Blend. And it's fairly straightforward. I mean, certain things you can't completely achieve, but the fact that you're gaining performance, gaining file size.
So does the customer sign off on the XAML then? I mean, where's the approval? Do you sign off in a format where you might find out later, oh, I can't do that, and we just got it approved by the customer, or have you had to deal with that yet, or no?
Not really. We have the approval processes all along for each stage. Once the visual design is actually approved is when we would go to XAML with it. And for us, what's really challenging is that we don't have the developers in-house. And we typically, a lot of our clients won't share code back with us. So we have a very distinct deadline, and we have a handoff. Here's the work we're giving to you. And frequently we'll get certain changes back to us because most of the developers don't want to touch markup. So we do get some things coming back that we go ahead and change. But
do you find the workflow, once you've handed over that XAML, though, when it comes back, how challenging is it to implement those changes?
It's usually fairly straightforward.
Okay.
Typically, they're not big architecture changes. I think all that's been nailed down early on. But there are, certain things like...
So it's not like we have a new database schema and need a little work here on the interface or things like that.
Yeah, and other challenges that arise with having the developers offsite are, data. Most of our applications are, lists of data in many cases. And instead of just giving the developer, what an item of a big list is supposed to look like, and there's going to be thousands of these, they might not be able to give us the database that we need to build this, so we have to write XML data files ourselves that kind of simulate what the data is going to look like, bind to that, and then we give something. Well, let me back up. It allows us to kind of work through, see how things are looking on the page, see how things are moving, how things interact from one page to another. The developer can take it and swap out that XML data feed for real data and change the XPath to paths and, not have to be in the XAML as much as they otherwise would be.
Okay. So, Rich, one of the themes in a lot of our other sessions when we talk about design and also when we talk about development is this concept of momentum and speed. That speed is really important. And sometimes just getting something out there that we can look at and have feedback on is a really critical part of software development. And it kind of flies in the face of maybe some of the traditional waterfall methodologies that we use. And I had a question in the audience. How many people do agile programming or paired programming? How many people are kind of in a waterfall method still where it's very methodical? How many people just regardless of what process you use, are kind of frustrated by your software development process right now. Okay. So, Rich, in addition to Jeff and Chip, you were in a contest called the FizzPop Design Challenge.
Yes.
And you brought a few folks over. You sat in a room, and Identity Mine actually put you through some training for a few days, and you went and built something.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what you learned going through that process? And kind of, when we've talked in the past, kind of a light switch went on with a few things in terms of the ability to move quickly to build things. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that experience was like?
Sure.
Both fun and maybe less fun?
Yeah, 3 hours of sleep wasn't fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, so at my company, we use Agile for everything that we do. For the FizzPop Design Challenge particularly, we had a technical developer, they had myself, and we had a designer. And when we got the design challenge, we had to break it apart. We'd had a lot of work done in that we had the personas and everything mapped out for us. So the initial phase that we went through was breaking down what we thought the rough features were, the things that we could actually do in 2.5 days, because you could build the world, but you don't really have the time to do it. So we broke it down into a set of key features, things that we really wanted to try and touch on. Obviously, things like the community, the media aspects, so those were key things. So once we had a list of the key features, product backlog basically in Agile terminology, we broke apart and decided who was going to be working on each of those tasks. There's a very clear definition between the technical pieces that we needed to build, the design pieces. So once we had those pieces shuttled off, we ended up building a source control environment.
Okay.
And actually
in 2.5 days.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was just easier for us to share assets that way. Yeah. And so our designer was obviously working a lot in Illustrator, and some time spent in design, in expression design, and a little bit of time in Blend. And I was working mainly in Visual Studio and Blend, and the other developer was working primarily in Visual Studio. So we were doing continuous integration the whole time. So we'd have design elements come in, and we would break those apart. Now, some of them we were lucky enough to get them in Illustrator, so we could actually bust them apart straight into Blend if we needed to by exporting them. So we built the UI very slowly from the ground up. And in terms of the supporting data, we ended up meeting in the middle. So I was building a lot of the user interfaces to talk to the middle tier, and we were slowly integrating the visual elements and hooking them up to the real data as we went along.
Okay. So Chip, Tribal was in the same contest.
Yep.
And you had some folks from very different backgrounds, right, that had never experienced our platform, lived a lot in Photoshop and Illustrator, worked on Macs. Can you talk a little bit about the developers and the designers, and they worked on that project, and what their experience was like coming into the technology for the first time? And talk a little bit about, I'm curious as to your insights about training. Like, how many people have never built anything in Silverlight? Anyone? Okay. So does that mean the rest of you have? Cool. What about WPF? Who's built WPF apps? Raise your hands. How many people haven't yet? How many people are in this room kind of figuring out, well, gosh, where do we get started with trying to get people exposed to this? That's kind of an issue, right? Chip, elaborate on that a little bit for me.
Well, so we tried to pick out people, I think, that, in our teams that we thought would be a good match for trying to learn these new technologies. So we had some Flash developers, and they typically have a PC and a Mac. They're able to work in both. And then a designer that typically, just all Mac, the Adobe Creative Suite. And so what was interesting is getting them exposed to, here's your new Mac. It's got Vista on it. You can go back and forth. There's culture clash right there. Yeah. And walk them through some of the tools. And you can't go deep enough. There's not enough time with the FizzPop contest to really go deep enough. There's just so many nuanced things that you can go into with these tools. And give them at least maybe some sort of mental mapping of what's going to work from the Creative Suite to Blend. So here's the exporter to XAML, for instance. That's very helpful for the designer, so they don't necessarily have to change their tools. Not everything gets translated, I think, perfectly. So there's some revs that you'll go through, and you'll learn that process through pain. I think it's a trial and error kind of a thing. And then some things you just, you approximate back in Blend. You'll take that design comp, from Illustrator and end up just doing it again, just repeating all of that work again in Blend, as Jeff had said. But I think overall the team, once they got past the fact that, Vista's running on here, I'm going to have to be working in both worlds, I think they got a lot more comfortable with it. There's a lot of things that they saw that were, oh, wow, this is interesting. Like, for instance, the tweening in Blend versus Flash, and all of those different features they started to call out and say, hey, this is cool. This is different.
Okay. So are there folks in the audience that have questions? I'd love to open it up for questions right now. If you have a question, we do record the session. Actually, can you come up to that microphone right there?
Am I allowed now?
I don't know. Are we recording in here? Can we hear him if he's over there, or should he be at the mic?
No,
Clint. Okay, I'm sorry. You have to go to the mic. I'm sorry.
We're in the spotlight, so should you be.
Maybe while he's finding the mic, one of the things that we were talking about earlier that I think is interesting with Blend is one of the things that really surprised me working with XAML, especially coming from development and being very particular about code and formatting and all of that, is really letting go of and giving up on hand editing the XAML and really letting the tools go through and build out the tags and edit and make changes through the interfaces. And you can still go in and hand code and edit the XAML, but it's the first time I've seen a visual.
That sounds heretical
tool.
to say that, coming from a coding
true,
background, right?
I mean, using any other tool, it creates this massive, gnarly mess of tags and metadata that you have to go in and clean out and
How many
rearrange.
times do you gut check yourself after you do it? You say, "Oh my God, what kind of code did you pop to XAML and just look at it every once in a while?" To see
I go back and forth and changing properties and editing things, or even especially when you have repeating elements and you want to copy and paste things. I'll do a lot of that directly, in the tags in the code. And just kind of see where things are at and how they're looking, and make sure things aren't getting auto-generated that are larger or out of hand. But I've really on all the projects never had to go in and clean up.
Okay.
And that includes starting early in the project and going through several iterations where you're changing a lot of things around it. I think one of the best things both Visual Studio and Blend do is manage the XAML and keep it very nice and tight, and really. You can do it manually, you can do it visually, and you can focus on the code. And you really don't have to managing the project. You just let the tools do the work. Okay. And I think that's something that was a surprise to me.
Okay, thanks for coming up to the microphone. Anybody else that has questions, if you want to line up behind? And I know there are people in here that have built apps that probably have experiences too. If you want to get up and share some of those experiences or challenge some of the things you've heard or discuss it, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm sorry, first questioner, go ahead.
Okay, so we've been developing with WPF for quite a while now, a little longer than a year, and we found in our design to development workflow that if you go, designers, and I'm not one, I'm a developer, we've seen them tend to, in Flash, they had the ability to actually make controls out of the things they were doing, like, they use a rectangle or anything like that, and they could action script it to do what they wanted. When they'd go into Blend or that workflow, when they'd be in Blend, they kind of take the same outlook where they use rectangles and animate those using storyboards to kind of get that list view feel. They wouldn't actually take a list view control, go down to the control template level, and edit that. And so there's a lot of throwaway XAML there because I can't really take the rectangles and shapes and animations and convert that to a list view. I have to actually go and create that from scratch, whether it's in Blend again or in Visual Studio. I'm just wondering, have your designers picked up control templating and modifying those controls, or do you find that when they're working in Blend, what solution have you guys come up with in your teams that, less throwaway XAML and more just design to development workflow?
So you don't all need to answer, but whoever has a perception on that. I know, Bo, that in some of the work that you've done, you've probably experienced some of these challenges, but it's unfair of me probably to ask that question of Bo, because some of the designers you have are kind of ninjas.
I'm curious. I actually don't want to touch that one because there's no good way to answer that without getting in trouble with somebody. So I'll let somebody else try it.
I'll take a stab at it. I think the key is getting your designers a little bit more educated on the fact that they're not building a comp, they're not building something flat, they're actually building a real application. And it means that they have to understand, when they're doing a comp, they actually have an understanding, this is a button, this is a drop-down list, this is a such and such. If you can educate them so that they know that there are analogs in the WPF control stack, then you're halfway to that. And something that Chip mentioned was a lot of the pair programming model. If you're doing a lot of that round tripping with a designer, developer, you'll find that you'll build a better relationship with them and they'll understand where you're coming from a lot better. So when they say, we're going to make this list view, you say, okay, so you're going to use a list view control with a control template, right? And they'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. So you just have to keep that process going because these tools have brought the designers and the developers a lot closer together, but a lot of designers and a lot of developers are very resistant to being close together because, let's be honest, you do get burned regularly. You know, here's a comp, go and build it. Well, what is it supposed to do? I don't know. So education, pair programming, that's probably the best way that you could attack that.
I was going to say, you know, one thing is that actually it's not as throwaway as it used to be. I mean, you can still take the XAML that's there and you're still gathering values and colors, and it's a lot easier of a transition between that and then what you had in the other tools, unless the exporters are good enough. But
it sounds like an education issue fundamentally.
yeah, honestly, like when we do stuff, I think, you know, a lot of times if somebody's never done control templating before, is that really their best place to be like learning right then? Mm-hmm. But let them hand you the XAML that they know how to hand you. You let the person who knows how to control template turn their thing into something that is useful, and then at least have a review process. Let them see what you did with their designs, and then they have that example as a template for them in the future of what they actually have created.
But it sounds like the magic opportunity, if there's any training companies in the world that want to develop curriculums, if we can get designers down that path to templating, that would be wonderful.
I think that's it. It's one of those things that's one of the newer nuances that doesn't have a direct parallel coming from another technology. And I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it, and nobody's really said this is the easiest, smoothest way to do it every time. And that was one of the challenges with Flash early on. There's 100 ways to do the half a dozen things you want to do. Mm-hmm. And it really took us all a long time to develop the habits and the standards and the practice to just make it seamless. And I think talking about the controls and the general styling is one of those elements where, unfortunately, there's just not a great process to follow, but there's plenty of different ways to make it work. You just have to kind of find what fits your balance.
Okay. So we've got 25 minutes left, so we have plenty of time for questions, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering what sort of is the best practice for like source control? Because we kind of have a mixture of Mac people, Mac creatives, and then we have the integrators, Flash guys, and then we have the ASP.NET guys, and all the code's a mess, and everybody's versioning things in their folders. How have you guys kind of dealt with that?
Yeah, can we get like a dedicated track for like source control for designers next year?
Yeah. So before I actually came to this session, I was looking up just that problem, and there is a client for the Mac from a company called TeamSplice, I believe, that talks to TFS.
Okay.
So if you can get your assets into that environment, I mean, if you're using something like Blend, you'll obviously be able to install source control, source safe, whatever you want to use, and there's not really an easy way to do it. Typically how we've done it before is we'll have all of the assets sitting on a network attached storage device, and then we'll back those up temporarily into the TFS instance, but it's usually the developers that are doing it.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Is it safe to say that source code control with WPF Silverlight is something people are concerned about? Can you just raise your hand if it's something okay. Yeah. That's just a trick I do for other people in the room. So, but thank you.
Yeah. But I'm having a hard time understanding going to a designer and saying, hey, you just broke the build.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You changed this element name. Why did you change it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think they can have maybe a separate tree or a separate, side-by-side folder to keep, if they want to keep versioning.
Yeah, the conversation's probably getting off on the wrong foot right away if you say you broke the build. And they're like, the what? Yeah.
But I think there's some usefulness there. But I think the developer should probably own that check-in and vet that as it goes in. Just to make sure.
So perhaps your paired programming or integrator buddy It's the one that checks it into source code.
I think it's one of the big advantages, though, of working with XAML as well over, the FLA with Flash is a huge challenge in source control and sharing projects. And, Flex addressed a lot of that, but I think XAML and working between Visual Studio and Blend, we actually use Subversion, and SVN has PC and Mac clients that work really seamlessly. And, it took a little bit for designers to get used to the process, but the XAML actually merges and diffs pretty seamlessly. So I definitely recommend if there's a conflict, if there's a challenge, if don't know what's going on, default it and leave it to a developer to resolve an issue and kind of decide where to go with it. And it's usually from the design perspective, they can just kind of check in and commit and revision, and everything pretty seamlessly handles itself. Occasionally you get breaking issues and things like that. Okay. But it definitely makes a big difference. And is when we were working last year with Silverlight, that was one of the things that really surprised us, is we simultaneously launched design and development continuously through the project development. And with source control, we're able to pull it off. Yeah. And I think that's a huge benchmark in interactive design that works really well across Silverlight and WPF. Okay.
There is a web front end for VS 2008 Team Foundation. So you can actually, if you're on Macs, you can actually go through the web front end on that.
Yeah. I got to say, as a designer, that sounds scary to me.
It is.
Too,
it's not.
Yeah. One of the things I'll do when we leave is I'll have cards up here, and if people want to capture some of this stuff, and we'll post a session later. If you want to learn about some of the specific tools we mentioned, we'll be able to share that with folks too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So one of the current limitations of Blend right now is you can't view multiple storyboards at the same time or in sequence. So things like a button enter and or mouse enter, mouse leave. And that's kind of a challenge for some of our designers. Do you have any tips and tricks on how to accomplish that, both for something as simple as a button as well as full page builds and transitions, without having to go to the developer to wire it up and go back and forth?
Yeah, it's tricky because, I don't know, what I find myself doing is just building all the time, looking at the first half of it and saying, okay, I think that's going to pull it off what I need, building it and taking a look and saying, yeah, okay, let me adjust this a little bit and going back. So I think you hit the nail right on the head with an issue there, something that could be improved.
Yeah. And there's the old hack of you build all the states out on one timeline, chop it up, and separate it out. But I think really the way things are shifting is one of the big differences between Flash keyframe and timeline is you don't need a starting keyframe. And I think really approaching the idea that there's no endpoint to a transition, there's just the state you're trying to get to. If you can't always create that methodology, that's the ideal, but it solves a lot of the issues of creating the perfect finesse of going from the up to the down states and all of that. But you also, if you can pull it off, you have to keep fairly simple transitions, fairly straightforward methodologies, but if you can pull that off, it eliminates a lot of strange issues like transitions between states, or if you have three-way states or multi-state buttons and interactions, you can jump in between them before one or the other is complete and never get these weird visual glitches. But you really have to kind of think through what are all the possibilities that the user can experience, and what happens when you have a 3-second transition and the user's going to navigate that something's going to create another transition in between. It creates a lot of tricky scenarios, but I find really looking at the advantage that you don't need that starting keyframe, and you can animate and transition any property from wherever it is to where you want it. Makes it a little more palatable when you're working with individual timelines for different interactions. But it's definitely one of those tool things that I could see improvements coming for.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Hey, my name is Laurent Bugnon. I work with Siemens. We work on quite a big WPF project for some time already. And I have a couple of comments, actually. One thing about who owns the XAML, right? That was a question. So I think it's important to see that there are two types of XAMLs. There is a functional and the resource XAML, or whatever you call that. And in our project, we do something which works very well. We actually separate. We have actually multiple DLLs, and one DLL holds the schemes, and the other one holds the functional code. And this is a nice way to separate and to give each designers and developers their playground, basically. And this also simplifies source control a lot. So it's something which is quite good. Blend can be improved in that area because it's difficult to edit inline templates when they are located in other files or other DLLs, but it's already a great help for that. Also, another thing we have, because this is a big project, so we have multiple development sites, we have actually another role, which is, we call that the UI custodian. The role for this guy is basically to be the mediator between the product owners, between the marketing people, and the development. And we found it necessary to have this role because or else product owners are really pushing too much requests, too much features, and this is there is really a need to coordinate that. So in our case, the UI custodian is actually the owner of the UI, so that would also go in that direction. For source control, we have also a tip, I can say. The source control, actually, we try to get our designers to use source control, but we are using ClearCase, which is, you know, that's a hell of a product. I'm sorry if any IBM people are here, but it's a very, very complicated product, let's say. So you need an on-site administrator, etc. So this is too complicated. So we actually have our integrators doing the source control. And a great tool to do that is WinMerge. That's a free tool, so that's why I mention it. And you can really have total control over the code that you receive, the code that you copy left and right, and integrate into the source control. Also, the last comment, bear with me, sorry. I think that what I noticed as a developer is that Blend changed the way that we do client development a lot, in the sense that I find myself actually putting code in my client because of Blend, because like this I can render like data, for example, for the designers. And honestly, this is the first time that I find it really good to modify the code for a tool, because usually, you know, you don't want to be dependent on the tool, right? But Blend is so powerful and so, you know, helps us so much in the development that it's really worth it. So I think it's really worth taking a look at, you know, things like model view, view model patterns, these kind of things, where you really do code so that it enables the binding in Blend. And yeah, that's a really great value, I think.
Right. Thank you very much for that feedback. You can pick up your check over here when we're done. And next year, we'll probably have you sit up here. We'll have the sixth chair. But thank you very much. Why don't we go ahead to the next question there? Was there any comments on that? I mean, that sounds like pretty good advice.
Yes,
and,
good advice.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Vertigo, and I'm an integrator. We call me and my other buddies there creative developers. We have, you know, a foot in both areas there. And yeah, one of the things I've been experiencing the last couple of years with WPF and Silverlight is a little bit different from the egg kind of a thing where it gets broken, where the developers will begin with the client trying to create the requirements and creating the data objects and start writing database schemas. Meanwhile, the designers are there with the client trying to figure out what the thing's supposed to look like, and it's sprint, so sprint 1, sprint 2, they're building out database connectivity, blah, blah, blah. The designers are still going back and forth with designs with the client. By sprint 3, hey, Robert, can you come here? You know, you're going to be working on this project now, and I have a design, and I have an application that the developers built, and what they built is beautiful. It's a perfect cube, and the designers have come up with the perfect egg. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to break that. I don't want to break that. It's a little bit different. Like, how do I make the perfect cube look like this perfect egg? I don't want it to look, you know, I'm not going to break that, and I'm not going to break that. And that's been kind of a big challenge for me going forward with projects. Think about source control for designers. That I've been doing a lot with people in-house and with our clients, designers as well. When I'm afraid they're going to break the XAML, I give them the part they need to work on. I say, okay, here you go. Put this on your desktop, fiddle with it, give it back to me. I'll check it into source code, because we can have projects where people are checking in stuff every 5 minutes, you know, and breaking code could be really disastrous. So I find that a lot of times, if there's a situation where somebody could break it, you know, the designer, because they're not really familiar with how all of that works, give them what they need to work on, let them work on it, and then I'll check it in for them.
Okay.
And I guess that's about it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Robert. So next question, and we'll do a wrap-up here. We'll take these last two questions, and we'll do a wrap-up.
Hi, I work for an advertising agency in London, and we've got a pretty incumbent group of really talented Flash developers. They're not that convinced by Silverlight, and I'm pretty sure it's mostly because they don't know much about Silverlight. They just say, oh, it's just XAML, it's just Flex. Do you have any advice for like the challenges of trying to create change in culture, and is it worth it? Because they're pretty good at what they do, and web services works.
So Bo, I am going to make you start.
For this?
I'm going to make you start on that one because I know you have perspectives.
Yeah,
on
I mean,
that.
we've run into that quite a bit, and I think I don't really think you convert. I mean, I think if you've got Flash developers that are really into Flash, they can pick up Silverlight, and some of them will like it better and become Silverlight developers, and some of them will stay Flash developers who can do Silverlight. And I think it's really just a matter of giving them the tools. And I think in terms of culture change or which to use, really depends on the projects. You know, I think if the client base is going to be a culture change, then you look at changing Flash developers to Silverlight developers. If you're doing the same type of work that you've been doing, you're successful with it, and the clients are really happy with it, then it's just extra effort. But I think we found both in that both the applications and the demand change a little bit, but also we just add a little bit more breadth. So, you know, now I'd say we have, you know, we still have a core Flash expertise. We also have a Silverlight expertise, but the vast majority crosses over both. And it becomes a project to project, client to client, you know, which one do we use where? And I think naturally there's a lot of resistance to that in terms of knowing how to do what you want to do with Flash or just liking the tools. But we've been surprised at every turn how much, once people just start using it, they can work with it, they actually enjoy it, they find things that work better, they find things that annoy them, but you know, overall it just becomes another tool and very quickly just becomes another piece of the overall puzzle.
I think you have to remind them, like when you first opened Flash Studio, did you know exactly what to do immediately? No. Bear that in mind. This is a new piece of technology, and it's horses for courses. You have to choose the tool for the job. But just be cognizant of the fact that you started somewhere, and this is starting somewhere, and it's just another tool to add to your palette.
Yeah. So can I ask one question, and Nate, I might ask you this too. You know, one of the challenges we have, though, is we have the standards-based web, right? And we have very device-specific applications that we build for Windows or Mac or cell phones. And Flash has really filled that intermediate need, right, where we have to go beyond the browser. Do you think WPF and Silverlight offer something there in terms of just the programming and work model? Because I think if I was going to answer that question, one of the biggest challenges I have right now is I need different skill sets for all of those areas, and I need different tools for all of those areas. And I think the vision that we have for Silverlight and also WPF is that, hey, you know what, if you know XAML, you can create Silverlight apps. You can create apps for the client. And you know what? Eventually, they'll be able to run on mobile phones and other devices, too. And we can reuse some of that skill set. And I'm curious, have you guys experienced that? I mean, does that skill set translate well? And are there benefits to that?
It does, but you always have to be aware of the gotchas. You can't always just take what you built in WPF and go, oh, yeah, it's just going to work in Silverlight.
Right.
Classic example, the containment model that was there. You didn't have grid. Now you do, thank goodness. But you have to be pretty, you just have to know where the little sticking points are going to be, and the containment model is a classic one. And the other thing is, when I look at Silverlight and I compare it to Flash, not dissing on Flash at all, but when I look at Silverlight, I see a pure application platform there under the covers. Okay. And it's because there's the .NET platform there and the programming models that come with using
So it's
.NET.
the depth that sits behind it.
The depth that's there is what drives, I think, building real applications. Not that you can't build real applications in ActionScript, but it becomes easier for me as a developer to do it in .NET.
Okay. And just different devices and platforms. I mean, the skill sets translate, and the tools are great in terms of Silverlight to WPF or the same tools and all that. But you have to develop an expertise that's unique to each platform. Yeah. You know, you can't build a desktop app and then, oh, I have this great mobile experience. Yeah. You have to learn and understand mobile experiences and start from the beginning how you're going to get there. So I think that's really
a warning.
overlooked.
That's a warning to all of us. Then,
yes.
to not unleash bad applications.
If you become a great WPF developer, you're probably already a really skilled Silverlight developer, but you still have to understand the intricacies of the web and develop an expertise per platform.
Okay.
I think that's the exciting part about it too, is that, you know, when I've been developing strictly desktop applications and waiting for Silverlight to get to the point where it is now,
the reach is much better.
Where I can now say, okay, all these ideas I've had about web applications, I don't have to learn a new technology. I can take what I have and translate it over. Okay. So for me, it's very exciting.
So next question, please.
I'll be real quick. That's pretty much a follow-up to what we've just been talking about. Who are you guys hiring? If you're ramping up your Silverlight practice, I have a hard enough time finding good developers. And now you're asking for developers with design or design with, with some...
And source control and project management.
Exactly.
You know.
Yeah, it's a brave new world.
Did you bring a resume, by the way?
So ninjas. You need ninjas, is what you're saying.
Ninjas are good.
I think you can train designers up to be ninjas. I think if you can find developers that have design sensibilities, or at least an appreciation, doesn't mean they need to be able to sit in Photoshop or Illustrator all day, as long as they can appreciate the discipline.
Right.
I think you can cross-train people to be effective, but you always have to draw the line between a developer building the core internals, and you can get somebody on the design side to get a lot closer to where you used to get before. But finding them, they're a rare breed.
Of course.
Yeah, it's definitely more training and
it's a
building
training
them.
thing.
Yeah.
It's more training than finding the skill set is what I mean.
And having an aptitude for it is important.
Gotcha. Last piece is Silverlight being in the state it is, even WPF, the limited deployment scenario that you can actually have. How are you guys getting around the fact that you have a project, and whether or not the client has mandated that this is WPF or Silverlight, when do you make that call that we've got this project and this is the way we're going to go with it versus Flash versus just standard WinForms versus WPF, those sorts of things?
Yeah. Well, for us, I mean, that's definitely a starting point. I mean, before we technically even have a project, is it Flash, is it Silverlight, is it WPF, which version is it? Because there's too wide a range of options to carry forward with. It could be any of these. So I think definitely committing to a technology and also a subversion of that technology up front is critical. I mean, sitting between Silverlight 1.0 and Silverlight 2.0 has been a huge challenge. Between WPF and Silverlight, for us, that's very easy because does it need to be cross-platform? Does it need to be web distributed? There's a few qualifying questions that'll answer that generally early on. Between Flash and Silverlight, it's a much broader range of questions. It's going to depend on the client and the specific needs. But I would definitely advocate pushing extremely early. There isn't a project until there's enough known to be able to commit to a specific technology.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question.
You talked a bit about the kind of poverty of information that happens when you use the old print method, where you get the comp and there's no information about transitions or activities, behaviors, anything like that. That poverty kind of comes from two places. So, sometimes a designer has an intention, it just doesn't make it into the comp because it's a comp. But sometimes they just don't have anything in mind at all. They just weren't thinking about that piece. How does it act in this situation or this? Have you found that the new workflow and the new tools have helped them not forget things? Or, does it help that second source of poverty at all, or is it just
I think it starts new conversations that typically haven't happened in the past between the developers and the designers. I think there's a lot more back and forth with these tools than with the traditional.
Well, it lets you find out, it lets you fail quicker, right?
Yeah,
totally. And you can find out, oh boy, that looks horrible or that won't work. And sometimes, and for designers in the room, we've all designed beautiful things that just fail when you build them, right? And you implement them. And I think being in the tool set, the sooner you can get to that point where you know if it's good or not, or even, I use the analogy of editing, right? If you edit pictures together or movies together, you may have a bunch of beautiful individual scenes, but sometimes you just cut them together wrong and they don't work. And I think the value of the process, especially when you work in agile or paired models with that person, is that back and forth and seeing that soon is what makes it valuable.
And you can use tools like Blend to do rapid prototyping as well. Bo alluded to this. You often build things in a prototyped environment that make it through to production, but it's easier to prototype things in these tools because it's generating concise XAML, it's generating tight code. You don't really have to mess with it that much. So if you need to work out a design problem, you can sketch it on a whiteboard and then go and build it. And for my group, it takes almost as much time to build it as it does to draw it on a whiteboard and relate the concept.
Okay.
Yeah. So the developers, though, need to be play a much more active role in terms of design and kind of the gotchas, because you have all these concepts that aren't entirely new, but always come up after you design in terms of what happens if you can't reach the data that you're dependent on for the page, or it's going to take too long. There's things that you can go all the way through release and not see these issues that you have because they're edge issues or fringe issues. And I think the developers are more conscious of those things because they're completely transparent to the designer, and they should be completely transparent to the end user as well. But I think there's simple things like what happens if there's data connectivity issues, what happens if something's running too slowly, what happens if there's a validation failure. There's all these things where sometimes you just want to make it completely transparent and the user's just sitting there and not seeing anything happen. And sometimes you want to work that into the design process of having the user get involved of, do I want to try this again or do I reload the page? And I think there's more conversations that need to be started between designers and developers to understand what their roles are.
Hey, Bo, I got to stop you. We've got to close our panel. We've run out of time. But what I'll do is I'll have the panelists stay up here. You can ask a question really quickly. But I have one final thing that I'd like to ask each of you. Very quickly, 30 seconds each. What's the one thing you would tell people about workflow for Silverlight WPF? And I'd love to start with you, Nate.
I think usability is way more important than it used to be. I mean, a couple years ago, differentiation was the amazing thing that we're going to be bringing to the table.
So not just working well.
Yeah, I mean, you can iterate until it's the right thing. And I'm a big proponent of we don't know what the right thing is at the beginning of the process. You can only find out what the right thing is when you're almost done. And it's always when you're almost done, you're saying, man, I wish I would have done it this way. And because things are just so much faster.
Great applications aren't finished, they're abandoned or released.
Yeah, everything is so much faster. You can save the project at a much later date.
Chip?
I think from a workflow perspective, the notion of if you're looking at a Gantt chart and you look at the design track and then you look at the developer track, I think you're going to start to see those overlap a little bit more. I think you're going to see development start a little bit earlier and get involved, like Bo said. And I think there's a lot of value in doing that. There's a lot of ideas that go just down a dead end, and you've got to back out of that. And if you find those things earlier, when the developers are involved and working side by side with the designers, I think you're going to vet out a lot of those problems earlier, and you're going to end up with a better product.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rich?
Bo took my answer.
Pardon?
No, sorry. Chip did.
Mm-hmm. From workflow, can you repeat the question? I think they took a different stance.
Sure. I would love just in 30 seconds or less, what's the one thing you would tell people about workflow with Silverlight and WPF? What's one bit of advice you'd give people that are starting to go down that path?
Design in a design application and do the integration as a whole separate phase. That way you can have a design that is a design that's not clouded by, how do we build this thing? And you can stay strictly in the look and feel mindset before you move on to the building mindset.
And Bo?
I think always design and develop all the way through. Use as many tools, as varied of tools that add value to what you're actually doing, and always have something that runs. Rather than just testing and trying things in a box, make it functional and do something, put it out, try it, iterate, do it again, and just keep the whole thing moving in both the design and the development context.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much, panelists. I'd like to wrap up by saying I took away some comments, too, from this panel. And the two things that really resonated with me is, one, understanding what the tool set is, right? It's a production tool set that lets you build things very quickly. But it's also important to understand that sometimes you've got to figure out the big picture in the process before that, too. So the whole concept of paper prototyping and figuring out and using that whiteboard is still important. But then once you have that idea, sitting down with the tool set can be incredibly valuable. Yeah. So what I'd like to remind people is there's a lot of good information that came both from the audience and the panelists today. This will be a session that's recorded. It should be up live on the Visit Mix site within 24 hours. So if you heard some great things here and you miss them, you can go back and listen to them there. I'm also happy to put you in touch with some of these guys if we have interesting questions later. Yes, Josh?
The open space, if we could continue this conversation in the open space instead of use.
That's a good idea. Why don't we do that? So if you have questions for the panelists, we'll go over to open space, okay? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, folks. Thank you, panelists.